I didn't expect to see so many of you. I hope you're all in the right room. I just want to let you know that it's the guy crying out in the wilderness is down the hall, and I'm just the guy in soft raiment. So just want to make sure that was clear. All right. Imagine, if you will, that you have a burning question, a question on the answer to which all your faith in someone or something crucial depends. If the answer is no, let us say, then your faith is secure, and you may rest in peace long before the earth has hidden your body from the sun. If the answer to this burning question is yes, however, then all your faith is in vain, and you, if you are not to live the life of some pagan of late antiquity, loudly invoking an ancestral goddess while silently disbelieving in her name, you must finally give up, stand down, turn away, begin again. Now, for a question of such importance as this, how much space-time will you give yourself to arrive at the answer you seek? A year? 10 years? 30? Forever and a day? How about 14 lines of 10 syllables each? So, my topic today, and I'll put it on the board really quickly. I think Chris mentioned that the title of my talk is Poetry and the Measure of Doubt. That's a little ambiguous, deliberately so. The topic, if I can put it on the board, because I'll refer to it actually as I go, is doubt in the verse of Christian poets writing in English. Christian poets writing in English. This is partly for the benefit of people back home. I also have a handout. If you have not received one, let me know. We can make extra copies as needed of that. So a little more on the topic, and this is kind of a way to segue into what the talk is really about. Doubt. So doubt can take all sorts of forms. I'm using doubt kind of loosely as doubts relating to matters of religious import. And in particular, specifically in this case, questions as to the justice of God. I'll talk more about why I have selected that specific kind of doubt in just a moment. Verse, I have chosen verse. I could have used the word poetry. You'll see later why I avoid the word poetry. It's a little bit of a vexed term, whereas verse I think is less ambiguous, maybe more precise. We'll talk about that later. And specifically, a specific verse form, and that is, as some of you may have deduced, the sonnet. So 14 lines, 10 syllables each. This is the sonnet that we are talking about, a particular verse form. You may have heard of it. I'll talk more about that later too. I have chosen Christian poets writing in English, specifically John Milton and Gerard Manley Hopkins, who are both known for their sonnets. Originally, I think I intended up until a couple days ago to look at some of John Donne's sonnets, and for fans of Donne, I apologize. He's actually a really good person to look at on this topic as well, but we only have so much time. My argument, I'm going to make this as clear at the outset as I can, because I'm worried that the whole thing is not going to be as coherent as could be wished. So something to guide you some part of the way will probably be useful. My argument is that the practice of writing and reading verse, and again you can think poetry at this point, is of value to Christians as, among other things, a reminder and an experience of our finitude before an infinite God. So once again, writing and reading poetry is useful to us, is of value to us as Christians, in a way that in some ways nothing else is, in this particular way, as a reminder and an experience of our finitude before an infinite God. That's part of the argument. I develop a little bit, but enough about that. Now, why doubt in God's justice? I could have chosen anything, right? A couple different reasons. You may have heard of theodicy. This is the word that is used in connection with questions of God's justice. A theodicy, theodike in the Greek, literally like the justice of God, something like that, is an account of God's justice, how God can be just in doing what he does, in, say, condemning who he does and approving whom he does. This question is associated with what is known as the problem of evil, as I'm sure you know. Another way of putting it is, well, one of the ways of putting a question related to this whole issue is, why do bad things happen to good people, for instance? This is a very modern question, and not just within specifically Christian contexts. Conversely, not just why do bad things happen to good people, but, as the prophet Jeremiah puts it, why does the way of the wicked prosper, right? Why do the righteous have it so rough, and why do the wicked have it so, wacky, wild? Take a word that begins with W of your choice. So this is a well-known question or problem or doubt, and it is of, it seems to me, particular relevance today, which is another of the reasons I've chosen it. So as I gather, after the question of God's existence, like, does God exist, the next question that trips people up is God good? Or how can evil exist if God is both perfectly good and perfectly powerful? It seems like a pressing issue to people today. In fact, it's such a stumbling block, it seems. You've got people like Bart Ehrman. I don't know if you're familiar with Bart Ehrman. He's a New Testament scholar, describes himself as having been a fundamentalist Christian, kind of became what he described as a liberal Christian, and eventually became an agnostic/atheist, it's not quite clear, as a result of his doubts on the subject of the problem of evil, basically. How, again, it is possible to recognize evil in the world, or unmerited evil, the suffering of innocence, say, with this idea that God is both good and all-powerful. So it's a pressing concern for a lot of people, it seems like. And I think the reasons for that are maybe two, probably more than that. One of them is historical, I think. For a long time, we had a kind of Enlightenment myth of progress, that things were just getting better all the time, sort of like a nice Beatles song, which ended in some ways, was rudely interrupted. World War I, people usually say sometimes. World War II, so much so that, not even Hegel these days would probably say that we are in a kind of uninterrupted climb toward the full disclosure of spirit, I guess. The second reason, I think, for the particular urgency of the question of evil, the problem of evil, theodicy, is our cultural view of suffering. I think suffering is seen nowadays as an unadulterated evil, right? Nothing good can come of suffering. I think we as a culture have lost a redemptive view of suffering that I think has been part of the Christian worldview for a long time. So suffering not only can be redemptive, but it's something we actually take upon ourselves for the benefit of other people sometimes. Suffering is inferior, that is, to love. And I think that view has been lost. So suffering, the existence of suffering, the necessity or the inevitability of suffering becomes a major stumbling block for people, much more so than it might have been once upon a time. Now, why the sonnet? So we looked at doubt specifically in God's justice and why I've chosen that. We're looking at verse and specifically sonnets and why we are going to be talking about that. And I'll try to move this along because I've got a lot of ground to cover. The sonnet is, as I've suggested, a verse form. And I'm going to really quickly put up a taxonomy that I will return to and develop a little bit. So I'll put over here on the right, I'll put over on the left, what the heck. Literature. And underneath literature, I'm going to let's put it way over here. Let's put verse. And underneath verse, I'm going to put, again, way over here to the left. And what left is and what right is, I'll talk about in just a bit. So verse is a form of literature, and the sonnet is a form of verse. There are other forms of verse, of course. You're probably familiar with them. Many of them, I'm sure. The ode, for example, would be a form of verse. The epic, the verse epic, would be a form of verse. Now, what is literature? What is literature? I believe that Ron talked a little bit about what literariness is, what makes literature special, what distinguishes it. I'm going to try to offer, maybe stick my head out a little bit and try to offer a definition of what literature is. So, many definitions of literature have been put forward. I'm going to be talking about definitions of poetry and verse too, so I've got lots of chances to mess up and advance something that's kind of ridiculous. But my definition of literature, a definition that I think can actually hold up, a definition that aspires to be essential, a Socratic definition, if you will, is writing consciously intended to communicate in more than a merely straightforward way. Writing consciously intended to communicate in more than a merely straightforward way. Why must it be intended? Why appeal to this subjective definition? Right? It's because we don't actually know for an absolute certainty whether an author has intended something to be to communicate in more than a merely straightforward way. The reason I appeal to a subjective element in my definition of literature is because objective qualities of writing are ambiguous. You can't look at something and know for certain, you can't categorize it for certain. For example, many of you are familiar with War of the Worlds, I assume. Many of you are familiar, H.G. Wells' novel, War of the Worlds. Many of you are familiar with Orson Welles. Some of you may be familiar with Orson Welles' broadcast reading of War of the Worlds over the airwaves. He read a lot of things over the airwaves. It caused a panic because people believed that War of the Worlds was a news report, and that aliens, tripods, were invading wherever this was set, right? So how did that happen? This was a novel, right? It had all the hallmarks of a novel. Obviously, H.G. Wells was setting out to communicate in an indirect way. This is fiction. Fiction necessarily communicates in an indirect way. It can say nothing about what actually exists because everything it's saying is about things that don't exist, right? So this should have been clear to the reader or the listener. Shouldn't it have? Well, the reality is that recontextualization can completely change our perspective of something. For instance, if I were to write the story of my life, a memoir, and publish it in a collection of short fiction, for instance, would you think that was truth or fiction? Fiction, right? Simply not because of anything in the piece of writing itself, but because of where you have read it. So this is a problem when it comes to defining literature. We cannot come up with a definition in this objective way that is going to single out literary qualities that only are to be found in literature. Now, another problem, apart from this kind of objective ambiguity, is that, and this is why I appeal to the subjective intention, is that all writing, and I think Nancy touched on this a little bit actually, when she talked about the truth that fiction conveys, all writing possesses literary qualities because language itself does. Language itself has embedded in it, for instance, dead metaphors. For instance, I'm going to take something that appears to be as dry as dust. The Battle of Hastings, and I'm changing the wording on this from where I found it a little bit, occurred in, I think it's 1066 or something like that. Now, how is this literary? How is this literary? How does it have elements that could be considered literary, depending on your perspective or the context, or any number of things. Let's look at the words. Battle and occurred. These are the ones I want to look at most closely. Battle, I didn't know the etymology of this until I looked it up, but I did know that most of our words come from other languages and had original meanings, often very different from the meanings that they have in our language. So this comes from originally Latin, batuere, to hit or to smash, and later it developed into a noun which meant military or gladiatorial exercises, right? Exercises. From, they're hitting each other, not slashing each other, not stabbing each other, but hitting each other. So no blood, no violence, an exercise. That's not what it means anymore, does it? No. And if you know your Latin, say you're Cicero, come back from the dead. You find yourself in, whenever this was introduced. 13th century, I think, is where it got its current meaning in French. You're going to be very confused, right? This is going to seem literary to you because it obviously can't mean what it literally means, because this is like a military exercise someone was talking about. It occurred in 1066. Unlikely. So this is one word, a dead metaphor, you might call it, that has a literary quality, but obviously this was not the intention. Occurred, for instance, another Latin word, comes from Latin, comes from occurrere, which means to run toward or to run to meet or something like that. And obviously, occurred has no sort of meaning like that in English, right? It is a dead metaphor. It's so dead, we don't recognize it as a metaphor any longer. The point is, English is full of this. All languages are full of these things. And if you know the first thing about etymology, about Latin, about Greek, every sentence becomes a literary experience. But it's not the intention of the writer to do that, unless this writer is writing for other etymologists. So the fact of whether language is literary or not, or has metaphorical connotations, cannot be the criterion we use in deciding whether or not it's literary. That is why I appeal to intention. If I were to write this, and I knew exactly what battle meant, exactly what occurred meant, and gave the reader to know that I was using this in this way, that would begin to get into the literary. Okay, I know you may have questions, but I ask you to hold them to the end. And we are going to have to really start cruising if I'm going to even get to half the stuff that I want to. Okay, so I said that literature was not only intended to be or to communicate in a non-straightforward manner, but that it is communicating in a not straightforward manner. What do I mean by not straightforward? This is not straightforward, right? Etymology, metaphor, symbolism, fiction, irony, non-representational sort of things. So music, for instance, is, I would say, inherently literary, kind of by this definition. Obviously, it's not writing, but you get the idea. Fanciful, elusive, all of these things are ways we could describe how literature communicates indirectly, we might even say. I don't want to confuse any of you who are familiar with Kierkegaard and his indirect communication. That's not what I'm meaning. I'm no expert when it comes to Kierkegaard, but I do reserve the right to appeal to the word indirect. Okay, so the Romantic poets, Romantic English poets. I am, in some ways, a romanticist by training. I read a lot of Wordsworth and Coleridge. I don't know if you know those guys, and if you like them, you probably know John Keats. Anyway, they wouldn't call this literature. They would call this poetry. Poetry. And that is why I do not use the word poetry in my topic. On the other side, finally we get to the other side now. And this is a thick line. This is the intentional side. This is the intentionally literary. On the other side, we have what the Romantics would call science. And Science as a kind of attempt to write in a completely transparent way, to hold a mirror up to the truth. Of course, that's impossible, if only because language itself is not transparent. So it's an impossible quest, but the attempt to write science, that intention is important. So we would put some things over here and some things over here. All right. Moving quickly along, definition of verse. I'm going to appeal to Wordsworth again, because again, I am a romantic by training. According to Wordsworth, who knew a thing or two about poetry, there neither is nor can be any essential difference between the language of prose and metrical composition. So we have over here prose. Usually we call this kind of the poetry versus prose dichotomy, but since poetry is up here, we have to use something else down here. How do we distinguish verse from prose? According to Wordsworth, there's no difference in the language we use. You could also use the word diction. This is our word choice. For instance, why do you sometimes see this? What does it mean, first of all? Heaven, right? Why do you sometimes see it with the apostrophe in the place of the E? Syllables, yeah. It makes one syllable out of it. In Latin, this V was a U, so it was really another vowel. And this whole thing could be effectively one big long diphthong. So hen or something like that. So the reason we have hen is because we need it to fit within a meter, a metrical scheme. We needed a one-syllable word and not a two-syllable word. So the only reason we have this is because of poetry, essentially. So could we say that if you see a word like hen, you know you're in the realm of verse and not prose? No, right? Well, you just saw it now. And this is not poetry. Or you could imagine a scientific treatise on metrical laws in which hen was actually introduced as a specimen to examine, right? So diction, even words that we associate almost exclusively with poetry, cannot be a distinguishing element. That's what Wordsworth means when he says, once again, there neither is nor can be any essential difference between the language of prose and metrical composition. So what does that leave us if there's no difference in the language? Well, it leaves meter, right? You've got the language of prose and the language of metrical composition. The only difference, the only essential difference, has to be the meter itself. It's implicit in his comparison, and I'm bringing it out. Therefore, thus and so, verse is metrical literature. Simple as that. Metrical literature. Prose is non-metrical literature. Now, what is meter? What is meter? We're moving right along. You guys are doing a fantastic job. We're going to get to our visual aid, so there'll be something to hang on to in the maelstrom of this community class. So, what is meter? Why is it even worth distinguishing from prose? Who cares, right? Who cares what verse is? Who cares how verse is different from prose? Who even cares what literature is? Well, I think we all do, but I'm playing devil's advocate here. Now, the conventional definition of verse, meter, is the regular alternation of stressed and unstressed syllables. If you would, please turn to your handout. Please turn to your handout. What happened to my handout? There must be another one. You don't mind sharing with Gil? I'm sorry, I can't imagine what could possibly have happened to my handout. All right. Anyway, please turn to the first page. We have here a brief lesson, a whirlwind tour of meter in English. What is meter? Meter is, this is almost more of like a description of meter, the pattern of stresses and we'll talk about what a stress is in just a bit, plus the number of stresses. So, in this schema, this little U is an unstressed syllable, and this / is a stressed syllable. So, follow along with me as I read from you a couple lines from some famous poems by Charles Algernon Swinburne, who, whatever you think of his ethics, was a fine master of English prosody. So, first one, Garden of Proserpine. Try to follow along with the unstressed and the stressed syllables as I read them. I'll overemphasize. Then star nor sun shall waken, nor any change of light. The next one, Hesperia. Out of the golden remote wild west where the sea without shore is, full of the sunset and sat, if at all, with the fullness of joy. Dolores. Obviously his subject matter gets a little risque. Could you hurt me, sweet lips, though I hurt you? Men touch them and change in a trice the lilies and languors of virtue for the raptures and roses of vice. So, how would we describe, using this classificatory scheme, where meter equals the pattern of stresses plus the number of stresses, how would we describe the first excerpt? Then star nor sun shall waken. What's the pattern of stress? Is it iambic? Is it anapestic? Is it trochaic? Is it dactylic? These are all Greek-derived terms. Iambic, right? We start, the prevailing pattern of stress is unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed. And how many stresses do we have? 3 stresses, right? So this is iambic trimeter. Iambic trimeter. This is how you would describe this verse form, this meter, really. What about the next one? Hesperia. Who can describe that for us? Is it iambic, anapestic, trochaic, dactylic? Again, we're breezing right through this stuff, and if you've never seen it before, you're probably lost. That's all right. Dactylic hexameter, exactly. We've got dot, 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 dot. Of course, this is what, the ancient epics are written in, right? You've got all of Homer's stuff and Aeneid, and I believe that De Rerum Natura is also written in dactylic hexameter. I could be wrong about that, though. Okay, dactylic hexameter. The final one, who's got this? Da 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 da. Anapestic trimeter, right? Yeah. So Swinburne is a virtuoso, and these are almost showpieces of his metrical abilities. The point is, the whole point of all of this is that this is a science. Or rather, that this is a complicated series of rules, that there are metrical rules, you might even call them laws, and that Swinburne knew he was writing in iambic trimeter. He knew he was writing in dactylic hexameter. There was no question in his mind, right? He chose to write in these things, and he chose to not write in a different way at any point in these poems. Okay. Why is this important? Why is this important? What does verse communicate indirectly, in a not straightforward way? As literature, verse communicates in a less than straightforward way, right? All literature does. What does verse communicate as verse? What does it mean when I choose to write in one of these meters? It implies, communicates indirectly, an acceptance of constraints or limitations. I have subjected myself to the pain of writing in these ridiculous meters, right? I love these meters, but it's painful. I don't know if you guys have written verse, but it's hard work. It's music in language. There are differences, of course, because you're also dealing with propositions, propositional content. The point is, This implies, the choice to write in verse implies an acceptance of constraints. Now, why is that important potentially of interest to us as Christians? Well, as finite creatures, we are limited, right? There's no way around it. Writing in meter can be an acknowledgement of this truth. That is an exercise in humility, right? I choose to write here. I'm acknowledging the fact, potentially, that I am a limited human creature, finite. It's almost a dramatization of my finitude. It's also an exercise, a practice, a spiritual practice or exercise to write in verse. It can be, anyway. That's one of my arguments. Counter-argument. Don't all literary forms impose constraints? So for people who've had writing with me, we talk about counter-arguments and refutations and all that kind of stuff. So this is very rhetorical. Counter-argument. Don't all literary forms impose constraints? Not in the same way. Let's think about it. If you're writing a novel, what's your constraint? Well, whether someone will publish it, whether someone will read it, whether you'll die before you finish it, but these are variable, right? Whereas there is no question what the constraints are when you're writing in dactylic hexameter. Every line is going to be dactylic, and every line is going to be in hexameter. Whereas whether it's the novel, whether it's drama, whether it's a short story, these constraints are not set in stone. They're fluid. For instance, at what point is a short story no longer a short story and a novel? Right? Who knows? There's no set rule. So you could write a novel and call it a short story, I assume, because there's no one there, there's no agreement or consensus as to where the line is drawn. That is very different than the kinds of constraints in poetry. It's one thing to note. In English, no verse form is so constraining as the sonnet. This was true at the time of the writers I'm going to be talking about. So, again, Milton and Hopkins, Donne, Wordsworth. This was true at their time. Now you've got the haiku, but I've yet to see a serious, a poet with an established reputation write haikus. I've written haikus. Nothing against the haiku, but it may be, I won't say it's too constraining. Anyway, I prefer the Japanese tanka, which is, the haiku is actually kind of a bastardized version of the tanka, which is a little longer and is more interesting, I think, than the haiku. But that's an aside. The sonnet is, as I submit, the most constraining form, and that's why I have put it way over here, right? So we're in literature, we've got science. Intention to communicate indirectly is what separates them. On this side of the spectrum, we have the constraints or limitation. So the willingness to submit oneself to the constraints of the sonnet. On this side, which would be the far side of verse, you'd have the ode. The ode, which has lines of variable length. I don't believe there are conventions, but there's no requirement as to the rhythm. Free verse is not verse by this definition, just in case you're wondering. Not that I don't read free verse, and not that I haven't thought of myself as writing free verse, but according to this definition, it is not verse, it's prose, right? You would have difficulty finding a single quality that all free verse shares, which suggests that even referring to all free verse as one thing, it would be difficult to justify. Please turn with me to the first of our sonnets. And we're not doing so badly. I've got another 35 minutes if I want to give you guys 15 minutes for questions, so that's not too bad. Untitled by William Wordsworth. This is what we're going to start with first. Just listen while I read. You don't have to read this really carefully or follow along really carefully. This is the one we're going to look at closely. Nuns fret not at their convent's narrow room, and hermits are contented with their cells, and students with their pensive citadels. Maids at the wheel, the weaver at his loom, sit blithe and happy. Bees that soar for bloom, sorry, I'm like hiccuping or something, high as the highest peak of furnace fells, will murmur by the hour in foxglove bells. In truth, the prison unto which we doom ourselves no prison is, and hence for me, in sundry moods, 'twas pastime to be bound within the sonnet's scanty plot of ground, pleased if some souls, for such their needs must be, who felt the weight of too much liberty, should find brief solace there, as I have found. Now, note, if you would, this is a very conventional Italian or Petrarchan sonnet, and it's Italian or Petrarchan as opposed to Shakespearean. The difference is Shakespeare doesn't really care so much about, well, the last two lines are usually a couplet, whereas the rhyme scheme is different here. And in the Italian or Petrarchan sonnet, of which this is an example, there is a division between octave, the first 8 lines, and sestet, the final 6 lines. And there is a feature of the Italian sonnet called volta, which is Italian for turn. And it typically comes, where would you think it would come? Where would the volta come? Where would the turn come? What's that?
The transition.
The transition, and usually actually in the first line of the sestet. And so one of the ways the Italian sonnet has been described by its practitioners, Petrarch, I believe, wrote theoretical stuff on the sonnet. The octave, the first 8 lines, presented the problem, or, more interesting for our purposes, the question, and the sestet presented the resolution, or the answer. So we don't have a question in this one. I chose this for a couple reasons. First of all, it's just an example of the sonnet. Here we have a perfectly conventional sonnet, 14 lines. It has an identifiable rhyme scheme. It's in iambic pentameter. This is exactly as you'd expect it to be. It is also conventional in that we have the volta right where we expect it to be. And does this turn? Does anyone have a sense of what this poem is about, or what's striking about this poem? Or sonnet, I should say, because it's not poetry. Or it's a kind of poetry.
Sure.
You've probably read this one before, Ron. So just one thing I'd like to call people's attention to. Look at how the sonnet is described. This is a sonnet about the sonnet, right? It's described as a narrow room, a cell, a citadel, a wheel or a loom, something at which one labors. It's also described, finally, in a roundabout way, as a prison, right? Of course, there's a turn where we'd expect to see it, because that is not a prison to which we doom ourselves. So if I choose, say this is, for instance, I am Henry David Thoreau and I will not pay a dime in taxes. Civil disobedience, right? That is not prison to which he goes, he would probably say, because he has willingly gone. He didn't have to go. And so there's a sense in which it is no longer a prison if we voluntarily, freely submit to imprisonment, captivity, etc. From this, I get echoes of stone walls do not a prison make, nor iron bars a cage. That's a very also famous English poem. But that's one thing to notice. Volta, we've got it where we expect it to find. What we want to pay attention to for our purposes as we look at Milton's and Hopkins' sonnets is, in particular, the relationship between octave and sestet, the relationship between question and answer, and see what happens there. These are all somewhat irregular, the Wordsworth's, Milton's, Hopkins' sonnet, because often, as you'd expect, the question ends with like a question mark or a period, some sort of punctuation, whereas we have here the feature that is called enjambment, where a line runs into the next. So we'd expect this to end after we doom period, because that's where the octave ends. But this runs on. And that's something important to consider as we move into the next two poems. Okay, so this distinction that Wordsworth draws between liberty, as he says, too much liberty. Liberty, of course, this puts us in mind of the French Revolution, at which time he was writing. And he writes elsewhere about liberty and duty and how true freedom may reside in something else. But we move on from Wordsworth. He's not the point. Really quickly, why have I chosen Milton and Hopkins, to whose poems we are just about to turn? Both were Christians who had relatively good reasons to question God's justice. Milton was struck blind in the middle of his career before he had gotten to start Paradise Lost, for which his entire career was meant to be the preparation. You've been burning the candle at both ends for 40 years because you felt like God was calling you to write really the one and only epic poem in English, and you're struck blind. You might protest a little bit at that. Also, ironically enough, Paradise Lost was written to, quote, justify the ways of God to men. So he had to deal with some of his own issues before he was able to do this. Also, Milton was a controversialist. He was politically and religiously vilified. He wrote a tract advocating for the liberalization of the divorce laws, which was not didn't put him in the good graces of the Puritans of the day. So we have Milton to thank maybe for no-fault divorce these days. Who knows? Hopkins, Gerard Manley Hopkins, born in 1844, how did he have good reasons to question God's justice? Well, he was a man of many sacrifices. He believed himself called to make a string of difficult personal sacrifices. First of all, he gave up painting. He called it, quote, a strain upon the passions, which I should think it unsafe to encounter. That is, he was writing around the time of the Pre-Raphaelites, aestheticism, where painting, visual art, and erotic art were very closely intertwined. This was a temptation to him. He gave it up. He gave up a close male friend because of an erotic traction that he felt to him, and he did not believe this was consistent with his Christianity. He gave up Anglicanism for Catholicism. He felt the call of conscience to convert, and in doing so, he gave up relationship with his family for quite a while. There was a rift made between them. He burnt his early poems when he became a priest because, quote, they did not belong to his profession. This guy was serious. And finally, he gave up England, his home, for Ireland, which he hated because that's where the Jesuits were sending him, essentially. So, this was a man of many sacrifices, a man called, perhaps, to more sacrifices than the average. So they both have reasons, perhaps, to question God's justice, relatively good ones, we might say. We all have reasons, of course, to question God's justice. That's why this is such a pressing, urgent concern, the question of God's justice. And they both were famous for their sonnets. In fact, Milton's sonnet, to which we now return, is probably one of the most famous sonnets in the language. And it's a difficult one, so if you would, please follow with me as I read. Untitled, interesting, John Milton. When I consider how my light is spent, ere half my days, in this dark world and wide, and that one talent, which is death to hide, lodged with me useless, though my soul more bent to serve there with my Maker, and present my true account, lest he returning chide, doth God exact day labor, light denied? I fondly ask. But patience, to prevent that murmur, soon replies, God doth not need either man's work or his own gifts. Who best bear his mild yoke, they serve him best. His state is kingly. thousands at his bidding speed, and post o'er land and ocean without rest. They also serve who only stand and wait. I have modernized this just a little bit, just the spelling, actually. I have not changed the punctuation, which is idiosyncratic, to say the least. We'll talk about that in a bit. And I have underlined the question, which we can talk about. So, what is the question being asked here? Can anyone put this together, especially people who haven't seen this poem before? Is it too much to take in all at once? Difficult poem by Milton? Difficult poem from the 17th century?
Okay, so he's considering how his
light is spent. He's blind.
Right. He's also considering the one talent which is He's also considering the one talent which is death to hide, which is presumably a reference to the parable of the talents.
Reference to the parable of talents, and this talent of his is, what do you think?
His
Poetry.
So his question is, does God still require day labor? Does he still require me to use this talent?
Light denied. What does that mean?
If I'm blind.
If he has denied me the light whereby to work, can he with any justice expect me to work? So another way of putting this is, and this is, I'm also going to be alluding to the parable of the talents, Matthew 25, 14 to 30. Is it just of God to reap where he has not sown? That's how it's put in the parable of the talents. It's effectively, I puzzled over this. I think that's what Milton is really asking. Now, we have talked about why verse might be of value to Christians intent on cultivating, perhaps, a sense of their finitude before God's infinitude. One of the ways we do this, and especially when it comes to doubt, it seems to me, is keeping this in the back of our minds. The fact that we are limited. Now, I think we actually see in this poem countless ways in which this question, doth God exact day labor, light denied, is softened, is moderated, is measured. Another name for verse is a measure, for instance. So this question is both literally and figuratively measured. It's measured by the fact that it's in verse. It's measured in the sense that it is moderated, softened. Just really quickly, I'll go through some of the ways in which this question is moderated or softened. What's the most obvious one? What do questions usually have at the end of them? Question marks. There's no question mark here, right? That's kind of weird, right? Okay, so that's one thing. That seems to me is one of the more obvious ones. If you had difficulty understanding this, that's because the syntax, the order of the words, is tortuous, right? This is a labyrinth of English words. This is deliberate. This question, if we want to call it that, is buried at the end of this, somewhere in this labyrinth of words, right? And when you finally stumble upon it, you don't even know what you're looking at. That's another way in which this is softened or moderated or measured, right? Also, notice that the question, who is it addressed to? Who's the question addressed to? It's not addressed to God. Doth God, this is in the third person we're referring to God. But who could it be addressed to? Is he asking himself? Is he asking himself the answer to this important question? No. We are asking this question of God, but we are not addressing God directly. This is another way in which this question has been measured, moderated, softened. Another one. Notice that the question is literally measured in that it is perfectly contained in a single line. This is significant. The question could have gone on and on, could have gone 2 lines, could have gone at least 1.5, could have gone 3 lines, it could have gone on and on and on, but it's one line. And note also the placement of this line. Line 7 this isn't even in the climax of the octave, of the question 4 sections. We would expect it to be, if it were going to be emphasized, in the next line. What do we see in the next line? Look at this. Patience to prevent. So prevent can mean a couple different things. It can mean literally it's kind of buried, dead meaning is to come before, to precede. So what has happened is the answer, the reply, in the language of the poem, actually precedes the volta, the turn. It comes before we expect it to. So this is kind of a play on words, but this is another way of measuring the question, as it were. He's not even going to give himself 8 lines for the question. He says, 7 lines is fine. It's not that important a question anyway. I can do it in 7. And in fact, the answer is going to be given some of the space I would normally reserve for the question. 2 more things really quickly about this question. What does fondly mean? What does fondly mean in this context? Well, foolishly. Foolishly. This is an old sense of the word fondly. So he has characterized his own question as foolish as soon as he's asked it. Note also that this isn't actually called a question at all. What's it called? A murmur. A murmur. And what is a murmur? When do you murmur? When you don't want to be heard, or when you're complaining. Exactly. So he's not really curious. He's not intellectually curious in some sort of answer as to the question of God's justice. He's complaining. And what he's complaining out of, well, what's the opposite of patience? Impatience, right? Patience comes in with the answer to the question that impatience has put forward. So we have just an incredible number of ways in which this question, and Milton is justified in asking this question. You would be asking this question too if you were struck blind after setting aside half of your life to prepare yourself for work that you felt God was calling you to, and suddenly it was a shipwreck. The modesty, the humility with which he has put this question is astounding. And note that many of the ways in which he has measured this question would be impossible without verse. So again, without verse, this practice of measuring our questions, of measuring our doubt, of reflecting upon our finitude, which we'll get to in a second, would be impossible. Now, really quickly, we're doing great on time, actually. We've talked about the question, how it has been measured, moderated, softened, made indirect. We also have, very interestingly, an indirect answer. An indirect answer. There are, well, how is it indirect? For one thing, God, who I think we have to take as the unaddressed addressee of this question, does not answer. It is not God who answers. It is patience who answers. That's one thing to note. Patience, of course, is what? It's not a person. Patience can't answer. This is like the definition of an indirect answer. Secondly, note that the answer does not address the question directly. So the question was, again, if I may be allowed to rephrase it a little, is it just of God to reap where he has not sown? The answer, if you notice, and I'm paraphrasing, is God does not need to reap where he has not sown. That's a very different answer to a very different question. What has happened here is the focus has been shifted from the question of God's justice. And when we question God's justice, arguably, we are presuming upon God. we are setting ourselves up as judges of God. It shifts the focus from the question of God's justice to the reality, the fact, of his sovereignty, his kingship. King is the language used here. And our subservience. How do we serve him? How do we accommodate ourselves to his yoke? Another way to phrase this shift would be, ask not what your God can ask you to do, but what you can do for your God. I've got a couple little jokes about here. Thank you for humoring me. Okay, we are going to, before we move on to the next poem, let me try to summarize. Two things we want to take from this. Two things we want to take. One is that this question, if you want to call it that, is not really a question. And its status as a question is undermined in all kinds of ways by the meter. So it's almost as though Milton were saying, indirectly, right, in a literary way, this is all intended, that this question of his, for which he has, in a sense, real justification to ask, and God gives us license to ask questions like this, it's all over the Bible, is not actually a real question. And to this non-question, the answer is an indirect one. The terms of the problem are changed entirely. Those are the two things I would like you to note from this. We could spend more time on this. It's a dense poem. There's more to be said about the answer. There are things I don't understand about the poem. I've focused specifically on ways that the line breaks, the meter, the octave versus the sestet all reinforce or actually make their own argument in a way that would be lost if this were not in verse. Great. Let us turn to Gerard Manley Hopkins's Thou art indeed just, Lord, if I contend. Sorry, it's Untitled too. And a quick word on that. I don't know what effect it has on you when you see a poem that is untitled, or when you see a email in your inbox without a heading. Maybe you click on it right away because it must be important. Maybe you put it in the spam box. With a poem, you are not going to, if you see a list, an index of poems, hyperlinked, you are not going to click on the ones as untitled. It's not going to happen. You have no inherent interest in anything that has not been titled. So this makes these unassuming, right? These are things that, I mean, for all we know, we probably know better, but Milton could have written this down on a napkin at Sherry's. Probably not, right? The point is, these are unassuming, and that is yet another way of reinforcing the measured nature of the question or the doubt being expressed in this sonnet. Note also that all of these poems are untitled. Wordsworth we can ignore, but if you were to, if I had used the ones from Donne's divine poems that I wanted to, you would have seen that they were untitled as well. And these are people who give titles to their other poems. Milton gives titles to other of his sonnets. Gerard Manley Hopkins has tons of sonnets that have titles. I think it's significant that there is not a title to this. And this is not directly communicated, right? The fact that this does not have a title does not communicate anything about these people's intentions directly or in a straightforward way. They communicate in what might be called a literary way. Okay. Epigraph. Justus quidum tu est, Domine, si disputem tecum, vidum tamen justa laquad ad te, quare via impiorum prosperatur. I didn't read that as they would have pronounced it probably in the Middle Ages, but Jeremiah, I talked about this a little bit at the very beginning. This is, why does the way of the wicked prosper, right? It's a quote from Jeremiah, book 12. This is the epigraph, which just means this is kind of the quote that you begin something with. I will read this, and we will spend really quickly 5 minutes on it. I wanted to give us all a chance to make observations of our own and all that, but we're simply not going to have time if we're going to have time for questions. Thou art indeed just, Lord, if I contend with thee. But, sir, so what I plead is just. It's really hard to read Hopkins's poems because metrically, rhythmically, they're so complicated. Why do sinners' ways prosper? And why must disappointment all I endeavor end? Wert thou my enemy, O thou my friend, how wouldst thou worse, I wonder, than thou dost defeat, thwart me? O the sots and thralls of lust do in spare hours more thrive than I that spend, sir, life upon thy cause. See, banks and brakes now leaved how thick, laced they are again with fretty chervel. Look, and fresh wind shakes them. Birds build, but not I build. No, but strain, time's eunuch, and not breed one work that wakes. Mine, O thou Lord of life, send my roots rain. I'm going to just make 4 quick observations on this poem, and I will leave you guys to look at this yourselves if you're interested. I've once again underlined, this is the only change I've made, the questions being asked. We have here, even though it looks like a division into 4 different sections, we still have the Italian Petrarchan scheme. There's the octave and the sestet. Note, of course, that it's debatable whether the question continues into the sestet, because it's not a question any longer, if you notice. 4 observations, or rather, observations on the 4 questions being asked here. How many questions did you guys count? I said 4, but count them for yourself. I could have lost count. 5? 5 questions. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, Isabel, tell me where the 5th question is. Why don't you go through the questions for us?
It may be wrong, but there's why do sinners' ways prosper?
Okay.
Why must disappointment
Right.
endeavor end? Wert thou my enemy? Which I might have counted as a question, but maybe. Okay. How wouldst thou worse, I wonder, than thou dost defeat, thwart me? I don't know. It's sort of.
You took defeat, thwart me to be 2 different questions?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, gotcha. I guess I meant, it depends on what you mean by question. I meant, how many question marks do we see?
3.
You only see 3?
Yeah.
Does anyone see a 4th one? Jeremiah, yeah. The first question asked in this is actually not asked by Hopkins at all. It's asked by Jeremiah. Similarly to this, I wrote up something really quickly as an introduction to the talk, and I started with, if we have never questioned God, then we are probably not thinking hard enough. And then I gave 3 examples of questions of God from the Bible. And the rhetorical force of this is to show that I'm not just, some vigilante theologian or anything, really, who's saying it's okay to question God, right? Don't take my word for it. Take what you see in the Bible. Take Jeremiah, take Job, take David. That is what is happening here. The first question, and it's a question, right, is Jeremiah's question, okay? Also note that it's in Latin. I don't know whether God speaks Latin or Hebrew or English or... the point is, this softens things in 2 ways. It's not his question, number 1, and it is in Latin. Also, because it's canonical, it's holy writ that's softened once again. Okay, this is the first of the questions. How do we know that Hopkins is asking this question? Well, he actually goes on to ask it a second time. Why do sinners' ways prosper? It's a translation of someone else's question. So it's getting a little bit closer to a direct questioning of God, a little bit closer, but it's not quite there yet. Look at the third question. Why must disappointment all I endeavor end? There are two things that measure this question. First of all, it's the other side of the coin. That is, why do sinners' ways prosper? That is, why do the righteous suffer? Right? It is implied in the first question. And if the first question is okay to ask, this implied second question is too. So it's not his own question, really. And also, note that who is blamed for the fact that all of his endeavors end in the way they do? Disappointment. Disappointment is the agent of this. It is not God who is frustrating Hopkins, it's disappointment. And who is disappointment? Who knows, right? No one is taking the heat in this sentence here. Also, it's Hopkins's projects and not Hopkins himself, right? This is a far cry from Job's predicament, where he's got rashes all over his body. Finally, fourth question, wert thou my enemy, O thou my friend, how wouldst thou worse, I wonder, than thou dost defeat thwart me? Are we finally to the point where we have a question of Hopkins' own? A pointed question to God? No. I understand this as a rhetorical question. And why is it rhetorical? First of all, it's imagining a situation that's very different than it really is, right? God is not his enemy. Not only is God not his enemy, which we might think, but he even says, but you're my friend. So this question about what God would do or wouldn't do if he were his enemy it's like a thought experiment, right? This is not a pointed question about any state in reality. Also, notice the word I wonder. When do you use I wonder in a question? So say, I wonder if Gil's going to be here tonight. Am I asking him whether Gil's going to be here tonight? I'm not, right? The I wonder signals that this is actually a rhetorical question. I'm wondering, I'm asking myself. If I were to ask Gil whether he's going to be tonight, I wouldn't say, are you going to be here tonight, I wonder? I mean, I could, but it's not typically how we use this, especially not in exalted Petrarchan sonnets, right? In this poem too, we see fascinating things. Really quickly, we're doing perfect on time. I'm right on the money. There is a turn. There is a volta in this. It's where we'd expect it to be, more or less. When he starts talking about banks and breaks and Freddie Chervil, notice that he is actually doing, in this sonnet, what he complains that he is unable to do, to breed a work that wakes. The second he starts using these E's with little thing over them, you know he's up to his old tricks again. So he is actually in the process of breeding a work that wakes. He is not just straining over and over, right? He is painting us a picture, and it is alive. So the poem itself, the success of the poem itself blunts or dulls the question being asked. It loses its force because disappointment has not ended this endeavor. Okay, this last bit is going to be in summary, and I'm going to read a little to you. I hope you guys don't mind. My reading is much better than my talking. Question, after all of this, why is the moderation or the measuring of doubt that is described and embodied in these sonnets an appropriate response in the face of thorny theological questions like God's justice? A prime, answer 1. The measuring of doubt is an appropriate response because sometimes our questions are not our questions. I should say, our questions are not our questions. And this is actually why I brought the board, to just for this little bit. Sometimes our questions are not our questions. For any of you who have a training in analytical philosophy, there are two situations in which our questions might not be our questions. And that's if they are not our questions. And for example, say they're Jeremiah's question. Say the question has already been asked, and say in the next chapter of Jeremiah, the question was answered by God already. Our questions are not our questions sometimes because they are not our questions. And I'll just do this, and you can pretend that it's never been struck through. Obviously, sometimes our questions are not our questions because they are not our questions. Rather than being products of a real desire for truth, our questions are sometimes expressions of impatience, Milton's murmur, or melancholy wonder, Hopkins's rhetorical question, or even indirect attempts at self-justification. Think here of the questions the Pharisees put to Jesus, trying to trap him, trying to test him, parable of the Good Samaritan, trying to justify his own not really doing anything for his neighbor. Those were questions too, right? Not really. Those were not our questions. A2, beta. Why is the measuring of doubt an appropriate response when we have doubt in God, questions? The second answer is the measuring of doubt is important because sometimes our questions are based upon fallacious or even presumptuous premises. Questions like those concerning God's justice, as in Milton, which we, as creatures, simply cannot ask without setting ourselves up as judges of our Creator, which is incoherent, right? To questions like these, we seldom receive direct answers. Instead, we get things like Job's indirect answer at the end of the book of Job. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? That is not a direct answer to Job's questions. And Paul's retort in Romans when God's justice is questioned. Who are you, man, to answer back to God? Not only are these not direct answers, these are questions too, right? Questions like these very bad ones that we ask sometimes are often turned back around on us. And this is one of the things we can keep in mind in moments of doubt and question. Are our questions, first of all, our questions? Are our questions our questions? Also, are our questions based upon fallacious and or presumptuous premises? In that case, they don't really have answers. There will not be direct answers to such questions because they wouldn't make any sense. Okay, to summarize, or to conclude, these abstract propositions can be derived from our study of these sonnets. We've just come up with this. This is an abstract proposition. Sometimes our questions are not our questions. Abstract proposition. Done? Case closed? Can we move on now? Is the literary form, or the body, as it were, to be disposed of once we have abstracted from it its content or soul, as we dispose of a flower from which we have pressed an essential oil? Can literary analysis like this take the place of its object? That is, could you have not followed along at all? Could you go away and never read another poem and take away from this the fact that our questions are not really our questions sometimes, or that verse does this, that, and the other thing? Do you need literature any longer? Of course, my answer is yes. And this gets into my final answer to the question of why this measuring of doubt is important. This is my conclusion. This is my peroration. Just as no number of abstract propositions is going to content someone who isn't after the truth, no number of abstract propositions is ultimately going to content someone who is after the truth. No amount of literary analysis is going to content someone who is after literature. The measuring of doubt is important, finally, because in the end, what we seek is not a direct answer to a question. We do not seek a truth claim. We do not seek an abstract proposition about the nature of reality. What we seek is the truth itself. And truth, as we know from the Gospel of John, is a person. The question to which Jesus Christ is God's indirect answer, the question that is at the heart of all human experience, perhaps, and certainly the question that is asked in those verses of Job, Jeremiah, Milton, and Hopkins, might be put in the words of this verse of David. My God, why have you forsaken me? But this is not a straightforward question to which we seek a straightforward answer. And in the person of Christ, God does not give us one. That is a direct answer. Instead, with his last words on the cross, he answers our question with another question. Indeed, he answers our question with the same. My God, why have you forsaken me? Hundreds of years ago, I heard your cry. I hear it now, and I know I am with you. Such, at least, is how I translate for myself the irreducibly literary last words of the Messiah. And with those words, as far from a straightforward answer as could be conceived, the human heart has been content. Thank you. Thank you for your patience, for your forbearance. Questions? You're telling me. Anything at all?
I was wondering. Red is probably good. Okay, red is good.
Ron, you're not gonna tear my exegesis to pieces, are you?
Not today.
Thank you.
No, I'm just teasing you. No, I'm thinking back to. I really liked the way you made the point about limitations when it comes to verse at the beginning, and then used the Wordsworth poem. I mean, that was very effective, I think. I was thinking about I was wondering how you relate to. You made the point that submitting to those limitations could be an act of humility and a reminder of our finitude, and I'm not disagreeing with that. I think that's right. Why is Wordsworth glad to submit to the limitations of the sonnet, and how does that relate to the point you're making?
Yeah. I don't need the microphone, do I? So in order to, I considered including a little more from Wordsworth. The relevant complement to that poem would be Ode to Duty, where he talks about, there are two stanzas in which he talks about, he reflects upon his youth. Wordsworth, if you know anything about him, lived pretty footloose and fancy-free the first 30 years of his life until French Revolution, and other events, potentially, whereupon he became certainly more conservative politically and potentially religiously. I don't know all that much about his religious convictions, but in Ode to Duty, he reflects back upon this time in his life when he was, to appropriate the words of the Apostle Paul, a law unto himself. And he says that he has reached the limit of that. There may be some who are able to be a law unto themselves, fortunate souls, brought up in the bosom of nature, but he's not one of those. And he regrets things that he omitted, things that he committed, when he was his own law, when liberty was his gospel. And he speaks of, he says, "Me this unchartered freedom tires. I feel the weight of chance desires." So you get the sense that this understanding of liberty or of freedom is much like our modern understanding of liberty or freedom. It's the freedom to do whatever seizes you in a moment. And he says, because of this understanding of liberty, he, at times, when he was younger, did what he wanted to do, even when he felt, in some sort of way, obviously there's a conflict, that he shouldn't. So for Wordsworth, it's complicated, but I think you could say that he is having doubts about the kind of freedom as, or liberty as understood by the revolutionaries, by some of the other romantics, for instance. So I don't know if that answers the question, but trying to, there is a sense in which he is doing the same thing by writing in the sonnet. He chose a very free verse form for most of his early verse, blank verse, which is iambic pentameter without rhymes, this was just about as close as you got to free verse at the time. In fact, Milton, when he wrote Paradise Lost, had a long disclaimer about the liberties he was taking by not writing in rhyme. So blank verse, which is what Wordsworth wrote in, was a kind of metrical counterpart to his ideology of freedom. So the turn to the sonnet, which he actually writes more and more sonnets. It's an empirical question, but I get the sense that he turned more and more toward the sonnet, and that reflects a change in his understanding of liberty, his theology, his politics, you name it. So does that answer anything
in bringing up all that stuff, that's fairly convincing. That probably is the sort of thing he was thinking. What I was thinking that he was thinking is the thing that I have heard a number of artists say, that language of those who have felt the weight of too much liberty. What they mean is, if I can do anything, if I'm setting out to create something and all I have is a blank canvas, it's too much freedom. I can't get anywhere.
No,
so
he means in a moral,
yeah,
not an artistic sense.
Right.
Yeah, Wordsworth was nothing if not, I wouldn't call him moralistic, but he was concerned with more than just the art. All the Romantics were, whether or not you happen to share their view of ethics and morals. They were far more, in fact, it's the classicists who've been characterized as the aesthetes, right? Romantics were not aesthetes, these guys. It was not, for many of them, freedom was the thing.
This is not specifically related to the main content of what you're saying, but you made some comment early on about the nature of meter and verse being associated with music, which struck an interesting question in me, and that is, it seems like early forms of verse were usually sung and associated with music. So I'm curious, do you have any sense of how and when that separation happened, or was there very early forms of verse that were not sung? I mean, there's obviously biblical verse forms. I assume the Psalms were sung. I don't know if all of the verse was sung. I don't know. I'm just curious if you have any sense. Maybe that's way too broad and beyond the pale here of what you're talking about, but it is a curious
I can
thing.
speculate. I mean, it's interesting even with the Bible, so you have all sorts of books written in what look like Hebrew meter. And if you see translations of these are paginated differently, delineated differently. And the Psalms are often, they have a heading, many of them. So a song, a psalm of David to be played by like the chief musician, that sort of thing. So it's clear that that the Psalms were, if not all of them, many of them meant to be sung and played and danced to even. And Homer, of course, as far as we know, his epics would have been, this was the bardic tradition where you would have kind of a minstrel or a bard who would go from hearth to hearth and basically sing of the exploits, often accompanied by the lyre or the cithara, I think is the other Greek instrument. So the earliest forms of poetry do seem to be forms of music, or at least seem to be accompanied by forms of music. And as to when that fell out of fashion, it was out of fashion by the time of the Roman poets. My guess is when printing caught up, and when literacy and printing sort of made it even possible for people to get these in a different form. Otherwise, it's like, until we could record these talks, your only way to hear them was to be there on the spot. But the change in technology, I think, is probably one of those factors. That's just my guess. I'm sure there are people in this room who know far more about it than I do.
And just
Elliot, for one.
And just a brief comment, just because I sometimes I can't help myself. There is one meter, it seems like, that is the greatest and most holy meter of all.
I sense a pun coming on.
The great iambic meter.
I knew it! Well, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate your coming out and really enjoyed seeing all of you, and hope I gave you some food for thought.